Say hello to the hundreds of thousands of viewers we have today who last night were watching the Oscars, but today they have tuned in to the Weekend Hangover.
Hello. Welcome to Weekend Hangover. We're talking about is Christianity logically consistent or inconsistent, and what does kindness ultimately have to play within those really heady, abstract things? They manifest in, as you made clear yesterday, in something very practical: kindness, tenderness. But today you're really hungover.
I'm really hungover. I mean, I just, we try to keep it real here on the Weekend Hangover. Between, we're all three on the continuum of melancholy. Okay, we're all three on that continuum. We could all just swirl in melancholy easily. And this weekend was one of those weekends that just felt futile. Like, what did I just do? I just poured my brain into that for weeks and expressed myself, and it was just no response. Like I said, your mom didn't. That was good. And it was it. And so I know, you can read her response. But Laura said she's kind of right. Laura, you're there. You're there today. So hey, if you are feeling too happy today, you have tuned in to the right place with the Weekend Hangover crew, because we will bring you down, man. We will bring you down.
Yeah, I just think you're in a good place, right? That's the other. Have you ever heard that interpretation of the Beatitudes? The blessed are you. That
No.
One translation of that would be like, you are in a good place when you are poor in spirit.
Yeah.
So I would say, blessed are you when you feel a little bit futile.
I mean, the part of that I agree with, it's true that when you're feeling spiritually bankrupt, you're open to a deposit, right? I mean, you're open. I get that, but that's the closest I've ever heard you come to saying something like, "Oh, he's in a better place." You are the master mistress, however I should say that, of not saying things like that. That's the closest in 20 some years of knowing you that Laura has come to going, "But Charlie, it is good to be in a dark spot.
All things work according to his purposes."
Yeah, that's right. And I don't want to hear that. But today's a day. I told you guys that I'd be at home reading. It's crack up. I'm reading this real candy fiction right now. You're going to crack up. I came across this book titled Blockbuster, and it's a murder mystery set in Durham, North Carolina in 1975 at a movie theater, back when movie theaters were real movie theaters, the 2 weeks before Jaws is to come out. And this 19-year-old is the assistant manager, and his boss gets murdered. And he is thrust into becoming the manager of this theater the 2 weeks before Jaws is going to come out. And it's really well written. I expected it to just be so poorly written. But those Martha's Vineyard murder mysteries I read are much not as, there have been 20 of them because they've been so popular. they're not written as well as this. It's blockbuster.
That's great.
Sounds riveting.
What book? Okay, now this is confession time. Insert your movie there that would make you interested in that narrative. If it were what? So for me, what got my attention was in one of my Jaws feeds. You know, they mentioned this book that this guy had written. It's so fun as a Jaws fanatic. It's spelled F-I-N-A-T-I-C, fanatic. And what movie for you two would you say, if you put that movie in there, I might be interested in reading this book? Laura, mocker of Jaws?
Well, my answer would probably be Dirty Dancing, so it's not great.
Oh,
it's not a great answer.
It's not a great answer. But
But
okay, it's your answer. I'm going to respect
My
your
answer.
opinion. I'm going to model healthy dialogue here by retracting my mockery of your Dirty Dancing selection. Austin, what about you? Please don't say Dirty Dancing. No, it wouldn't be Dirty Dancing for you for sure.
I mean, I suppose some kind of subplot from one of the obscure characters of like Frank Nabasky from You've Got Mail, like his relationship with that the woman from the news, you know. You know, like something like that would be.
I thought it would be Ocean's 11, 12, 13,
or
14,
a
15,
book
16,
that is, it's kind of like a I don't know, a John Malkovich type thing, but Frank Nabasky's novel.
Who played Frank Nabasky? Was that
Greg Kinnear?
Greg Kinnear. Okay.
How about that, Laura? Like his novel.
I mean,
like someone write a novel
what's-
that's his novel. It would be incredible.
Well, what's kind of funny is Tom Hanks. We're getting super nerdy and not interesting, but Tom Hanks has a book all about typewriters.
Oh, I've read it.
I
Yeah.
know.
So-
That's I read
I
that
have
too.
it.
It's really
Yeah,
good.
it's great.
It really is
Tom
like
Hanks,
a
he's
You've Got
great
Mail
writer. He's
sequel.
hilarious.
That is.
He's
That's a
great
You've Got
writer.
Mail prequel or
Yeah.
sequel, something. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
In
So
the
there's
universe.
that. So today I would be, if it weren't for Weekend Hangover saving my soul today, I would be quietly reading Blockbuster and seeing where this 19-year-old promoted manager, how he was going to solve the murder of Horace Buford. Okay. So there's that. So thank you, Weekend Hangover, for saving my soul today.
Just so you know, Charlie, people are in the feed trying to make you feel better. So they're
I
giving
don't
you
have the feed in
positive
front of me right
feedback.
now, so I appreciate a supportive Weekend Hangover community. I'm feeling very marginalized today. I'm feeling
Somebody
very-
says that some of their friends liked it. They didn't say that they liked it, but they said some of their friends liked it.
Well, I think whoever that, Laura, they get
Sherry
credit for
Morgan.
trying. Sherry,
Oh,
you get
She says
credit
it was
for
fabulous,
trying.
but she says it's her friends told her they liked it. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I have Sherry in the world, Sherry Morgan in the world. So thank you, Sherry, for being there for me today. Well, we want to make this whole, one of the things that I told you guys is I thought I'd get credit for acknowledging that this is a very pedantic philosophical subject matter. But yet it's it's in every pop song. I mean, believe it or not, it's embedded into our thinking, and it has horrific results when you think that, in the words of the t-shirt that I think it was Dylan Klebold was wearing when Columbine happened, naturalism rules. With the inevitable conclusions of that is the dehumanization of people. Really, it's most pronounced. It's at the root of why I don't need to overcome racism if it's all natural selection. And so, we're going to walk through. So those of you tuning in right now, get out your handy iPhone, smartphone device, and follow along. We're going to go through the discovery questions that we post every week, and we're going to model what some of our people do. They take these 3, 4, 5 questions, and then they just have their group time over that, having all heard the message from the weekend. It's one of the reasons why we're integrating our content as much as we can. Tomorrow at Pizza Paul and Mary at CESO, we'll be teaching on this content again in a different application from Psalm 14. So let's first of all, the first question is, G.K. Chesterton said that a belief in atheism presents an insurmountable contradiction. Finish that thought as if you're having a conversation. But I wanted to do that with you guys because you're both so good at it and you've had so much experience at it. Let's go backwards before that question. Laura, what are for you the basics of having a spiritual conversation with someone that is not condescending?
Whoever's across the table from me, like if it was G.K. Chesterton and he was across the table from me smoking a cigar, or if it was
in quotes,
yeah, really long.
Quote.
Just talking about that sun rising again.
Hey, I just want you to know I'm not one of those people who's quoted G.K. Chesterton, but have never read any of his books. I have read his books. I just want you to know that.
I've only read one.
I've read probably 3. Laura, you've probably read a lot of his books.
I think 2. I got 2.
Okay, I think I've read.
I would say
back in the 80s.
I think so. If it's him across the table, or if it is like I have friends who don't believe in God, so I think my strategy is always just to tell me more, because a lot of times, the more somebody talks, the more I can start to understand not just what they're saying, but where it comes from. And I would say we were talking earlier about just conversations in the church lobby. I use the same trick there. Like when people used to come to me to talk about something in the service that they didn't like, the lights or the sound, or I would just say, tell me more about that. And eventually they would come down to some frustration they had with something that was deeper or that was more communal. Like it very often came down to some kind of relational experience or feeling. So I think I would say listening is a really big piece of having good spiritual conversation, but also like listening because our first responses are kind of very often defensive, and letting another person talk for a while breaks that down enough and takes away our defense and maybe gets us into a more open space where we can actually speak to what they're really feeling and thinking, and not just our talking points.
By the way, here's the other thing too, is on that note of tell me more. One of the things we teach students who are self-conscious is when you go to a party, the surest way to appear brilliant is to use the phrase, tell me more. And people think you're the most wonderful person who ever walked the planet, because nobody at a teenage party is used to anyone listening to them. But if you're the one going, tell me more, it takes the pressure off of you and it puts it right back on that person. Yeah.
I also think who is the person who says the thing about tell me which God you believe in, because there's a good chance I don't believe in that God either. You know,
I remember I heard Strobel say that one time. Yeah.
It's just a pretty brilliant idea that a lot of people's, the more they explain what it is that they don't believe in, we may find some common ground.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because I know I've used that a lot, because it's a paradoxical intervention. In psychological terms, you're aligning yourself with disbelief. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I also like, if you're, that sometimes in a conversation, on that note, Laura, hey, if you want to borrow my God for a while, let's just lean into this together, and you borrow my God. I love that imagery. It's you don't believe in, just borrow mine for a while and see how you can test that out. Austin, you have a lot of conversations. Would you just say ditto to that, as far as in the atrium in particular, conversations with people? You had some yesterday that you would say to our weekend hangover listeners, hey, here's some keys to make sure you connect.
The saying in AA I always hold to is look for the similarities, not the differences. You kind of say that to new people coming into AA. I would echo what Laura's saying there with a emphasis on listening, taking that position as opposed to the more passive than active position. I've learned pastorally, people don't need someone to talk with, and they don't need to hear them. They don't need to have someone listen. They need to have someone sit there so they can hear themselves talk. And that 9 times out of 10 is pretty therapeutic for people, especially when it comes to the more deeper problems of tragedy in one's life, or spiritual conundrums, theological conundrums like theism and atheism.
I remember it's really hard to do this with family, isn't it? And I think sometimes that's where you get into messy, contentious.
That's where I've had a good practice with some family members, though, that I have on in-law side is, I've had some really good conversations with them where they want to start a conversation, kind of poking fun at Jonah and the whales type stories, and let's look for the similarities here, not differences. I don't say that, but in some sense, we're agreeing with how ridiculous that story is. I personally think he died and came back, but I don't talk about anything of what I personally think. I think that's a way to, that's a very silly story. Let's have fun with that. You know?
And by the way, your faith in Jesus doesn't rest on whether Jonah, covered in gastric juices and his skin whitened from the acids, literally, said, wow, that was quite an experience, and walked in and preached to the Ninevites in a way that compelled them to repent. As much as what I believe about that story, your faith in Jesus is not dependent upon that. So per that,
I mean, I would counterpoint that we have seen it happen in the documentary Pinocchio. So we know it's true.
And there are in the catacomb, in some of the catacombs, in archaeological sense, it is interesting. Just we're totally sidetracking here, but there are a number of highly verifiable events that are documented into the walls, and in one particular catacomb, one being the resurrection of Jesus, and a number of other events within the Roman Empire, some Christian, some not. And one of them that is along with all these events that are highly verified is the Jonah and the whale story. So,
And to be accurate here, God put that in there because it was a big shark that did it. Okay, he just Leviathan.
I will say one thing.
Carcharodon Megalodon. I'm just telling you, it's what it was. That was he created a fish.
One thing that this has me thinking about is not just like what we say about some of these, like, these stories that are easy to like deconstruct or whatever. But to me, nobody can ever deconstruct my love for scripture. So like, I hope that like the young people who I've had a hand in their life or whatever, that maybe they go and they do hear something that contradicts, but they can't, like, whatever experience I gave them of, I love this story, I press against the story, I dance with the story, I doubt some of the story, but you can't ever like fight against my love of it. So I would love for more like young people to have adults in their life who just love the story of God and ask questions of it honestly and openly, but who never stray from loving the possibility that this story is ours. And so that's the thing when I think about like apologetics, is you can't really fight with somebody's love of the story.
And that helps you. That frees you up. It seems like, to put you in a position of just of doubting with them or questioning with them. A position of tell me more. That's very interesting.
Good question.
And like as we were saying before this, kids don't respond to your content. Kids respond to your tone, and they will respond in kind to the tone you give them. And I think there's a little bit of when you're giving in that conversation that tone of, well, that's very interesting. I think it's going to be reciprocated towards you, a much more pleasant conversation. Another thing I always say similarly is when something preposterous is said or some ridiculous assertion is made, it always a good helpful one is just, that's interesting. Where did you read that? And someone has never read that. Something ridiculous anywhere usually, so that's always a good one.
Or if they say Twitter, then that even sounds stupid.
Yeah, you just say, oh, okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I use that. A lot of people use that with the Bible too. The Bible says, which part?
Yeah,
which part did you read that in?
This too shall pass. Oh, really?
Yeah.
God helps those who help themselves. Yeah. Okay, last week I touched on the 22nd anniversary of Columbine. And I said they're more likely to happen. The complexity of our plague of mass shootings notwithstanding, they're more likely to happen, as is Germany in the 1930s and the annihilation of the Jewish people, are more likely to happen with nihilism, with naturalism, than not. What does this say about humanity? That the tendency is, and so Laura, yesterday I mentioned to that point, the metaphor of naturalism. It was William Golding's The Lord of the Flies. If you ever read that, the metaphor of, in the absence of as I said yesterday, Miss Bloodworth on the playground can go to hell in a handbasket real fast.
Mm-hmm.
But you came across a story that is an exception to the rule. And then I ask you a question about that. So tell the story, just assuming that people know the Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
And yes, I did stumble and accidentally said Lord of the Rings just because it rolls out of my mouth so easily. I just said that, I caught myself. So the story, a really fascinating story that is the antithesis of that, the exception to the rule.
Yeah. So just last week, this guy, I think his name is Peter Warner, and he was an explorer, like a seafarer, like an old fashioned, like jumps on boats and just rides around the waves and sees where the water takes him. And he made it to 90, I think, and he passed away last week. And one part of his story is that there was a moment where he was in the water and came across this small island, and he rescued, there were these 6 Tongan boys who some shipwreck or some kind of catastrophe had put them on this island by themselves. But instead of like warring and trying to like get rid of each other, they basically like built a little society, and they had a couple things, like they had a schedule for responsibilities. They had a like system for like if somebody got mad at somebody, they had to take space and like put themselves in timeout on the different sides of the island until they were ready to talk about it peacefully. And they basically had been really careful with somebody broke a leg at some point, and they worked together to build him a splint. So just having that in my head, thought, well, what if kids read that story when they were young, so that instead of like seeing each other as potential enemies, when it all comes down to it, they saw each other as fundamentally cooperative. That these stories that we tell about who we are to each other and who God is to us very often do become the thing that governs the way we live together. And so it's really important that our overarching stories are filled with kindness and justice.
Yeah. And when you were telling that too, I was thinking about the fact that I was nurtured every day on Channel 6, WTVN at 5 o'clock on Gilligan's Island. And now I understand why. I understand how an island can work. Because the skipper was clearly in charge there, wasn't he? I mean, I know the professor was smart and Mr. Howe had money, but the skipper was in charge, right? We agreed on that? The skipper was really running the. Did you know that Gilligan's Island?
I don't have a lot of Gilligan's Island.
Oh my gosh! You didn't watch? It was on every day at 5 o'clock on Channel 6 in Columbus, and just grew up watching Gilligan's Island. I say that facetiously, but to say this, I would love to know, in those 6 kids, I would bet money that there was a benevolent dictator leading that the one who perceived to have the power, the skipper, was benevolent and created that culture of esteem and respect, etc. And the point being, in the absence of that absolute authority of respect, humanity's tendency is it digresses into, we don't like the Jews, we're going to eliminate them, right? We're going to enslave this people group that we perceive are less than human. And that's history. That history has that narrative, and that's what Golden based his thesis on when he wrote Lord of the Flies. I remember that from being scared to death when I read that book and watched that in literature class in middle school. What is your hope? I said yesterday that my hope in America is what I'm looking at. It has to be people who have power using that power to protect and raise up the vulnerable. That's the hope of America. Proverbs 18:14, a crushed spirit who can bear. So many of the Eric Harrises and Dylan Klebold's that are entering into schools have been crushed by bullying. Right?
Yeah.
And
I mean, my response to hearing yesterday was that we, in addition to like this crisis of belief and philosophy, and we also just have a crisis of belonging. And I think everybody's talking about that this year, just because we've realized how much we crave and need company of other people. But it's also true in these mass shootings very often, is that these people had such a strong like isolation. And
constant word in it, isn't it? Isolation.
Yes.
Isolation.
And I was telling you guys, one of the most inspiring movies I've seen this year was Crip Camp. which did not win an Oscar last night, sadly, because it went to the octopus.
Spell that. Crypt or crypt?
Crip camp, like
Okay.
like kind of a diminutive word for handicapped folks, but CRIP. But it's them naming themselves that. But the idea of it is that there was this camp that these kids all went to when they were younger. It was run by a bunch of hippies in the 60s, and it was a place of radical belonging and inclusion. That everybody who was there had people help them get around if they needed it, help them get dressed and fed. But it was a place where they all felt like they belonged. And so when you watch the movie, the first part of it is just about crazy kids at camp. The second half of it is how many of these kids went on to change the world. So Judy Heumann was a person who went to the camp growing up, who was like led the disability acts. The reason we have ramps at government buildings and schools and churches is because of the things that these kids who grew up at this camp did. And it's because they had one moment in their life where they felt like they were fully included, where they were loved and where they belonged. And so it opened up their imagination that maybe the rest of the world could be like this. And for me, I see everything through the lens of what does the church need to learn from this? And it was a thing that I think is the dream of the church and the dream of the community of Jesus, is that they would give people such a beloved space in a place where they could imagine a whole other way of being a person.
Yeah. I love that. We said this, the church, our church, Southbrook, is defined by its ability to reach the marginalized. We're not defined by our ability to make the successful more successful. We're defined by, do we have a capacity to make that person who's marginalized everywhere else feel like they have a place where they can belong? Of course, that's what City Lights is about. You find your tribe, you find your place of belonging. And
and so much of it also speaks to young people too, right? So student ministry, the things that held me in place when I was struggling with faith were, I had this one place where I felt loved, and I just would come back to that no matter what the arguments were.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue with feeling loved.
Well, the surest way, question 4, to make God's existence real is through radical kindness. What would you say to that person who's listening and they have a phone today, they have email, and they can listen to the Spirit say, hey, here's a person whose spirit has been crushed. Reach out to them and be kind to them. What would you, Austin, start with you and then you, Laura, what would you tell someone who's listening to this today? Say, the value of Weekend Hangover was, because of that, I did a God thing. I reached out intentionally. This is the value of our half an hour together, is that we reached out intentionally and God took on flesh through my kindness. What would be your challenge as a pastor to people today living in America who may be listening to this, what they need to do to show God to the crushed? I'll start with you. What do you think is the most practical? If this happened a million times over, America would be a different place today.
Yeah. I don't know what part it was in this series when we talked about it, but I'd shared a quote from a contemporary rabbi who said goodness in a debate of good and evil. He said that goodness is not allowing anyone to be humiliated in your presence. And kind of at a fundamental sense of, if you're operating out of that kind of mode of being, then boy, you're creating goodness. I think that's what we see in John 8. I think that's when the woman caught in adultery to be stoned and
humiliated.
I think there's also something to the spatial nature of that passage where she doesn't come up to Jesus, he comes down to her. I think that is a bit of affecting that quote in some sense. So I think that's a good starting point for people.
I love that.
Said it before, but I think it's worth bringing up here in light of yesterday is the way you closed it. I know I'm at my worst when I'm at my least tender. I think tender is kind of a even more particular virtue within the larger general kindness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a gentleness. Laura, what about you? I love that, Oz. I appreciate that reminder of not allowing a person to be humiliated in your presence. Laura, what about you? And speaking of which, it was really humiliating yesterday to have Todd Porter wear the Michigan stuff. So Laura Buffington, I want to give you props today for dressing appropriately for Weekend Hangover. Way to go, Laura Buffington. She just increasingly goes up in esteem in my eyes. It was an intentional rebound from yesterday.
Todd's probably gotta correct it.
Yeah. So for you, what you go, hey, this Southbrookers, listeners of Weekend, you do this a million times over. This is a different country. What is it?
Yeah, I think my theme for particularly the quarantine has been, if you think somebody needs encouragement, they do.
Yeah.
Like, there's nobody whose like name you can think of right now who'd be like, nah, they don't need to hear that they're doing all right. You know, like if you think somebody needs encouragement, they do. Like, so whoever you think might be just thinking that they didn't do a good job on Sunday and nobody liked what they said on the microphone. Like, if you know anybody like that, they probably need encouragement.
Send those messages to Laura Buffington right now. She's on the feed. Charlie and Sherry McMahon, if you're listening, I want you to send a message to Laura Buffington right now.
I mean, I just think it's speaking of like being humiliated, sometimes it's you feel almost humiliated to encourage someone. Like it is a humbling stance.
It is
to tell someone else that, you know, or we think that we haven't earned the right to tell them they did a good job or something, but man, we all just need to hear that we're holding in, we're doing all right. We're probably doing better than we think. We're with each other. Like, I just think that we need to say
the tongue has the power of life and death. I mean, the tongue can resuscitate a spirit. The words can act as a, breathing life into someone. So just remember that today. That's where it would make God real. Let's have dialogue with people about logic and coherence and questions and stuff like that. But let's do it in kindness and respect, and we'll change our world. Next week, we're going to be dealing with science, the question of science. Does science contradict a belief in God? Obviously, this is one of the big ones that you can't do a series on Christism without talking about the issue of science. I think it's exciting because science to me is the friend of our faith. It's amazing. And I'm looking forward to that. Eric Fleming's going to be doing the teaching on that. Laura and Oz, it's always good to get to talk to you for an hour and a half or so doing this every week. And we appreciate all of you who are listening. For those of you who gave encouraging words to me via Laura, you have a special reward waiting for you in heaven. Until next week on the Weekend Hangover, that's Austin. This is Laura and Charlie. And next week, Austin will do the introduction like he was supposed to today before I jumped in. See you next week.